national flood insurance claims. And all of that is really to say, anywhere that it can rain, it can flood. If you don't have flood insurance, I encourage you, floodsmart.gov, just a little side note. So let's talk about resilience and how that works and what we in DCR really are looking toward and moving toward in how we do business. Just in general, resilience is the ability of a system or community to absorb a disturbance, a storm, things that happen that disrupt the natural environment. Resilience doesn't mean that we're going to return to our pre-event state, right? But resilient communities have the ability to adapt and manage and recover to a great extent to storm events and things that happen in those communities. One of the things that's really important on this slide is that for me, especially in the resilience space and talking about equity, is the ability to continue to meet the critical need of community members and maintain a sense of community identity. Oftentimes when there are floods and disasters, communities are displaced. You know, everything that you know is gone, and having the ability to help restore that community identity is really important when you're talking about resilience. So equity and resilience. This one, I want to talk about some things that have happened in the past year or two. There have been studies that have been published by FEMA about their ability to manage their programs and how they disproportionately affect communities that are low income and minority communities. In a November 2020 report that was published by the FEMA National Advisory Council, they specifically talked about the equity that isn't happening in the administration of their programs. And in a publication called The Social Roots of Risk, Producing Disasters, Promoting Resilience, it states, I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but it's really important to hear these words. Disaster vulnerability of individuals and groups is associated with a number of socioeconomic factors that include income, poverty, and social class, race, ethnicity, and culture, physical ability and disability, language competency, social networks, and social capital. Let me say that one again, social networks and social capital, gender, household composition, home ownership, and age. These same factors that disadvantage members of society on a daily basis also play out during disasters. The everyday living conditions of the nation's poorest, sickest, most dependent, and most isolated residents directly and indirectly increase the exposure of these residents to physical hazards and to the social, economic, political, and psychological impacts of disaster events. What we know for sure is that low-income and minority communities are often situated in areas that are known to flood or have environmental consequences. This has been a historic way that things have developed across this country. And what is the saying? The chickens are coming home to roost. We're having that kind of situation now where we have a lot of disadvantaged communities in situations where they are experiencing extreme flooding, and we have to do a better job. And I take that challenge on for my agency to ensure that we are running equitable programs that not just look at people who are vulnerable to flooding, but vulnerable communities who are subjected to flooding. And there is a difference there. So the study went on to say that current programs do not consider the principle of equity in financial assistance relief. Damage assessments are based on property ownership, which immediately focuses on wealthier parts of a community and disadvantages renters and the homeless populations. I don't think a flood has a particular direction where it only attaches to folks who own homes. everyone is impacted, but the recovery is not the same. The public assistance program most benefits communities that can afford to pay the required match and can navigate the complexities of the contracting agencies. Individual assistance programs are more accessible to those with time, income, and access. And even the National Flood Insurance Program, the program that we're charged with managing, inadvertently assists wealthier segments of the population, really only serving those who can afford to buy flood insurance. So we are leaving a lot of people behind in the way that we are consistently doing business according to policy. So these studies were really important to point out and identify some of those things. So really the most important thing here is that through the entire disaster cycle, no matter where you are, communities that have been underserved stay underserved and suffer needlessly and unjustly through this process. So the whole community approach to resilience. Just a couple of things to mention there. Getting to my notes, sorry. Rolling through these slides, not paying attention. A common understanding is needed for the hazards and the risks and the consequences for the entire community. Historically, we have done, outreach and engagement, and we talk to the same people about the problems that are occurring in communities, and what we find in what we see where boots meet the ground. There are a lot of people that are being left behind, whether that's the perceived value of those communities or property values that are established or other things. But we really have to look at what it means to have a whole community approach to resilience. It really requires an integrated approach to reducing risks that includes preparedness, response, recovery, and prevention. Establishes new goals and higher standards that move simply beyond regulatory compliance. And that's what a lot of programs do. This is what's required. This is what we do. Anything outside of that, we're not going to manage. Whatever the consequences are, we're following the rules. And we really need to look at how we're operating our programs. And of course, use the best available science and incorporate climate change, sea level rise, storm surge, and current flood maps. So who really needs to be involved in these conversations when we're talking about the whole community approach to resilience? And how can we really identify what's going on in our communities? And does what citizens say really matter? So the outreach and engagement strategy that DCR is working to deploy is one that has the framework from the DEQ Equity Division. It is totally based on making sure that we are engaging people where they are so that we have a clear understanding of what their needs are and making sure that the most vulnerable people have a voice in our processes. So particularly what this says is that the affected and vulnerable community residents have access and opportunity to participate in the full cycle of decision-making processes about the development of and updates to our plans. And we're talking about the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, as well as the Virginia Flood Master Plan. And that decision makers shall seek out and consider such participation, allowing the views and perspectives of community residents to shape and influence decisions. And this is from the code. Well, it's not from the code yet, but there was legislation that was introduced and passed this year that specifically talks about the way that we should engage, how we should develop an outreach plan, and that is where we're going. Fortunately, it aligns perfectly with what we were wanting to do anyway, and we're already on that process, so it's a really good thing. So flood planning, states play an essential role in that. What we know for sure from different studies that have occurred is that a lot of states use the hazard mitigation plan. There is no rubber meet the road kind of plan like we're trying to craft with the state master plan or with the coastal resilience master plan. So I think we're in a good position to really move forward with comprehensive strategies that are really going to give us a whole community approach to resilience and planning. Again, the Coastal Resilience Master Plan has been issued. I think it was in December of 2021. There'll be folks who talk more about that, so I'm going to just skip by that in the interest of time. And the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan, again, based on best available science, identify and address socioeconomic inequities, and recognize the importance of protecting and enhancing natural infrastructure and nature-based approaches to mitigation. Community scale, understanding of fiscal realities. We know that that is a tremendous issue when we're talking about flood mitigation. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars. And so we have to be realistic about what we're going to do, spend our resources wisely, and make sure that we're mitigating to the greatest extent possible. The plan for Virginia has to include an inventory of flood-prone areas. We already have that in our Virginia Flood Risk Information System, an inventory of flood protection studies, working on that, record of flood damages. We have that information through our FEMA resources, strategies to prevent and mitigate flood damage. That is part of the planning process, and the collection and distribution of information relating to flooding and floodplain management. That will also be part of this process. So one of the things that I want to say is how we're going about this, because it's a little different. We're getting ready to send out a survey to our NGOs, not even our traditional NGOs, they're included, but others as well. One of the things that my team and our public communication office has really dug into is how do we get the information we need? So when we start communicating with our NGOs, we're not going to ask them, so tell us how flood impacts you. We're going to ask for those folks who are dealing with housing insecurity and food insecurity, domestic violence and all of that. When storms or disasters strike, how does that impact the people you serve? That gets us a different answer and helps us understand the impact on our most vulnerable citizens. And that's really how we're moving through our programs. So just want you all to know that we take our role seriously and that we are truly trying to build a more equitable Commonwealth and work on the resilience aspects of our programs for our most vulnerable communities. And there's a lot to do. Thank you. Mary-Carson.
Thanks. So hopefully we don't duplicate much about the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Mary-Carson and I are going to run through at lightning speed how Virginia has gone from 0 to 60 in the resilience space over the last 4 or so years. Many of you in here have been involved for many, many more years than that in the research that led up to all of these policy changes. So let's get started. So very quickly in the last 4 years, EO24 directed the Special Assistant for Coastal Resilience and Adaptation and the Chief Resilience Officer to develop a master plan that started with a framework that set forward principles, which included a preference for nature-based solutions, for centering equity and many other key issues, and required recommendations for state free board to be set and for increased coordination across the state. 1 year later, at William & Mary's VCPC conference, Executive Order 45 was released, which established the NOAA intermediate high curves from 2017 as the curve that Virginia was planning to. Of course, a couple of weeks ago, NOAA released some new curves, but we won't get to that today. But this is the key planning curve across the state based on Ben's recommendations, and recommended a free board standard, which we'll get into more detail in a minute. And this equates to approximately 4 feet by 2070, but then added a foot to that free board standard. And then as we progressed through the master planning process, EO 71 established a technical advisory committee, and we'll see how that's moving forward today based on the General Assembly session that is nearly wrapped up.
Great. So we're going to talk about the Virginia Flood Risk Management Standard, or the Vfms, that was established through EO 45 and EO 24. So this state freeboard standard was modeled off of the federal flood risk management standard that was famously dropped by Trump 5 days before Hurricane Harvey hit. Luckily, the FFRMS was restored by the Biden administration. It represents the strongest freeboard standard that we know of anywhere in the United States. And essentially the gist is that state-owned buildings, so state investments, are not allowed to be constructed within flood-prone areas without a variance. And the variance is where some of the specificity regarding how high structures would need to be built comes into play. And this all started on January 1st of 2021, or it went into effect then. And the freeboard requirements are for the 100-year flood zone and the 500-year flood zone. So these are two different zones regulated by the National Flood Insurance Program that basically are high and a little bit higher risk for flooding. And then on top of that, we have sea level rise projected inundation areas that just take this standard one step further. So there are varying degrees of elevation that you can see here based off of where a proposed structure is going to be built in one of those zones. And the more risk you have, the higher you go. But the first preference is not to build in these areas at all. Just want to talk briefly about the Department of Environmental Quality and some of the changes that occurred legislatively regarding DEQ. In 2020, House Bill 1164 was enacted, which requires DEQ to address climate change by developing and implementing policy and regulatory approaches to reducing climate pollution and promoting climate resilience in the Commonwealth, and by ensuring that climate impacts and climate resilience are taken into account across all programs and permitting processes at DEQ. So, you know, if you were in the talk just before us, you know how a lot of that has been implemented. And I think that any opportunity to provide climate change education to any of our agency staff would definitely be helpful, because this is no small feat. I just want to note that as part of this, there was a directive to establish a working group on environmental justice. And this group was established to assess and provide recommendations regarding agency improvements to meaningfully engage environmental justice communities and fence line communities in decision-making activities. The working group was made up of 10 environmental justice coordinators representing each of the secretariats. And the working group was tasked with conducting an assessment of the processes and resources that are required of state agencies to develop agency-specific environmental justice policies. You can read the work group's 2020 report on the website, and it's great to hear that that group seems to be helping advise with some of DCR's outreach, which is wonderful. Okay. In 2021, the Virginia Department of Transportation issued new engineering guidelines for bridges that includes climate change into that guidance. And important to note that this guidance will also be expanded to address surface transportation, so roads and highways as well. This document considers not just sea level rise, but also temperature change, salinity, and precipitation or rainfall intensity. So this is a broad suite of impacts that are affecting transportation structures. And important to note that for these different risks, there were different standards adopted by VDOT. For sea level rise, the NOAA intermediate high projections, which is consistent across the state, as has been mentioned. The temperature impacts were drawn from downscaled data from the 4th National Climate Assessment. The salinity impacts were were made basically assuming long-term predictions of saltwater intrusion that will shift the borderlines between freshwater and saltwater in the rivers and streams that feed into the bay. And these were derived from a 2018 study by the Virginia Transportation Research Council and looked at year 2100. Precipitation impacts assume a 20% increase in rainfall intensity and a 25% increase in discharge for the design of bridges through this guidance. And it's important to note that the precipitation changes are generally lining up with the City of Virginia Beach's new study, if you're aware of that, and the new Marissa assessments that we're going to talk about later in the presentation. So this is really showing us that we have a pretty good idea of what the data is showing for changes in intensity, duration, and frequency related to rainfall. Another kind of win for flood risk and flood risk awareness was a disclosure law that was passed in the 2021 General Assembly. This law requires that sellers disclose if a property is a repetitive loss property. So repetitive loss, for those of you who are not NFIP nerds, is when a structure with 2 or more NFIP claims of more than $1,000 are claimed within any rolling 10-year period. And the real kind of interesting message here, or kind of buzzword, is actual knowledge. We're not really sure how this disclosure is rolling out in practice, but it's on the seller to disclose to a potential buyer.
So changing gears to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. In 2020, the regulations were amended to include coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change as one of the purposes of the act. And we know that shorelines are changing, which puts properties at risk that are already going through that are in the CBPA area. And property owners are acting to protect their property. So we needed a framework to both inform and help property owners, as well as protect against erosion. And at the end of 2020, draft regulations were issued by the Soil and Water Conservation Board. And those regulations were approved after a comment period this past summer. And those state that local governments shall assess the impacts of climate change and sea level rise on any proposed land development in the resource protection area during the plan of development or project review process. So that looks out at a 30-year lifespan of the project or the lifespan of the project, and uses the NOAA intermediate high curves again, as well as the impacts from slush models and the FEMA flood maps. And looks at potential future impacts as well. And localities can require alterations to the proposed development. So if you install an adaptation measure in the RPA, according to these final regulations, it must be a nature-based solution and approved by the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership as listed in the Virginia Stormwater Management Practice Clearinghouse, and approved in the tidal wetlands guidelines. And MC will talk about how those are interacting more so in just a second. And this could be an eligible activity for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. A stakeholder advisory group was created to develop guidance for the new regulations because this is very complex. As are kind of everything in resilience, it goes across so many different pieces, and how all of these pieces interact is really where the challenge and the progress is. And so the guidance hopefully will be sent to the stakeholder advisor group soon, with the next meeting set for next month. And the target for guidelines is later this summer. So turning also to the Tidal Wetlands Act, another revision in 2020, moving from living shorelines as preferred to living shorelines as the default erosion control option. Unless the best available science shows that it's not suitable, an applicant must incorporate elements of living shoreline approaches to the maximum extent possible. And VMRC must establish standards and guidelines to ensure the protection of shorelines and sensitive coastal habitats to ensure no net loss Again, we're looking at these 2017 NOAA intermediate high curves. And of course, the site-specific conditions, which is where you can see where a site might not be suitable, depending on fetch or the upland slope and the structure's proximity to the shoreline. And again, these would be for the useful life of the project.
Okay, so pretty big changes to the CBPA and to the Tidal Wetlands Act. This idea of linking efforts is just paramount because we have so much confusion along our shoreline in terms of governance. And if you are an implementer of these regulations, you know this to be true more intimately than I do. And so I'm obviously preaching to the crowd here. This idea that we have some overlap in jurisdictions along our shoreline where the two different regulations are interacting creates a lot of confusion. And when we talk about sea level rise, what is permissible in tidal wetlands is impacting the RPA in the future because our RPAs are the tidal wetlands of the future. So this is like the thing that I kind of keep repeating in my mind all the time, and it's scary. So this overlapping of jurisdictions makes the modifications to the existing regulation and the guidance that will be developed extremely complicated for government staff who are responsible for compliance. And if we thought modifying the law was complicated in 2020, the actual implementation of these changes at the local level will be even more convoluted. Local governments who are responsible for advising community boards, whether it's wetlands or CBPA or joint boards like exist in Virginia Beach now.
No, we had a joint training. So
Joint training.
Virginia Beach.
Yeah. So this information really needs to be specific and detailed on how to actually administer the new CBPA regulations and the tidal wetlands guidance. And specifically, the guidance really needs to say how these new standards interact with one another on the ground. Kind of crystal clear for enforcers, applicants, and administrators is really critical. And for us, trying to figure it out, as you'll see on the next couple slides, it's about as clear as mud. So this idea of a clear roadmap for how to help property owners who are working to address considerable erosion and property loss concerns without compromising water quality protections that are inherent in the Bay Act and without losing more tidal wetlands to sea level rise that are already projected, which is now 89% of tidal wetlands loss by 2080. That's what the Coastal Resilience Master Plan says. So this work is just so important for the health of our existing and future wetlands. Okay, so why it's clear as mud. So as you all know, over 95% of Virginia's coastline is in private ownership. And so we really need to think about when a property owner would attempt to make an improvement along the property, what that really looks like. We need real life examples of how these changes would factor into permit application on private properties. And this is an example of Wetlands Watch's attempt to walk through a permit to install a bulkhead along the shoreline under these two big regulatory changes. So the question is the retaining wall an erosion control structure? And if the guidance says that it is, then you go through the VMRC process. If the guidance says that it isn't, then you ask, is it a nature-based solution? And if you look at this, bulkhead is not. And so now you know that it's not an adaptation measure. And so it's not an erosion control structure. So this is what it looks like when you follow the actual text in these regulations. If you agree that it's an erosion control structure, it goes through the VMRC process. And then you ask the second line of questioning, which is, does best available science show that a living shoreline is not suitable? This looks like a place where a living shoreline would likely be suitable given depth of water, again, I don't know where this is, and so don't come at me if it's not, but to me, it looks like maybe it could. So then you say yes. And now we know that an approved sea level rise standard must be, that the wall could be approved if you're using the right sea level rise standard. And if best available science says no, then the living shoreline must be installed with sea level rise standards in place for the useful life of the project for 30 years. So that's kind of how it works. And this is, again, our understanding of it. This is my favorite one. This is another example of us working through another shoreline erosion control structure that's called Fleximat, if you're familiar with it. It's one that a lot of property owners are very interested in our rural communities. And you can see through this that you get different answers to the questions. Is Fleximat an erosion control structure? And so this illustrates the problem, right? It's not exclusively. Is it a nature-based solution? Kind of, we're not sure. So it's sort of TBD. So now we're stuck and we can't really move through the process. Is it an adaptation measure, which is part of the Chesapeake Bay Act? Maybe. Is it an improved BMP? This has a lot of people asking questions. Maybe, but not yet. Is it an eligible nature-based solution activity under the Community Flood Preparedness Fund? This is another fun wrinkle in the regulation. It links back to a grant program. And in the manual, this is what's cited. Yes, it seems that it is under the CFPF. So it would need to meet locality future conditions for sea level rise, and then the permit would need to be granted. So I hope that you're as confused as I am. We know that these exercises are really just showing how complicated the process is and how critical it is to provide specific and detailed examples to decision makers who are tasked with these two big changes on the ground. So in 2021, the fund keeps going at the General Assembly to include climate change and everything. The VDH, according to Senate Bill 1396, now must include climate change impacts into the regulation of on-site septic systems. This law is so important because rising sea levels and increased rainfall are drowning and stressing our septic systems all at once across the state. And these impacts are bad news because they contribute to poor water quality, economic stress, and uninhabitable structures, which is then further damaging local economies. Important to note that, again, another example of Virginia leading the way on this issue nationally. To our knowledge, this is the first state, we're the first state in the nation to tackle climate change and septic regulation head on. And lots of states are looking to Virginia to see how we handle this uncharted territory. VDH is doing a massive overhaul. It's important to note they're updating all of its regulations. And there are 6 work groups that are helping. Okay, and important when we're talking about equity and inclusion, there is a grant that's available for loans for addressing equity concerns with paying for these very cost prohibitive structures.
So pivoting to the Community Flood Preparedness Act for a very quick minute. The CFPF is a community funding for flood resilience planning, capacity, and projects that is funded from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that Virginia joined last year. It provides loans for grants in the current version. In code, it could provide loans in a future grant manual for projects, studies, capacity building, and planning across Virginia for all of the flood risks. So whereas the Coastal Master Plan only addressed the coastal flooding, any community with a flood risk could be eligible for these funds. And Carolyn will speak to how Hampton has used this in a minute. And it prioritizes, really importantly, a community scale approach and nature-based solutions, and has a set aside of 1/4 of the funds for funding in low-income geographic areas. So we can see that 45% of the proceeds are 135 million, and we've in 2 rounds of this funding as we're just ramping up. The program is brand new, just getting going thanks to the DCR team. Projects have already been funded across the state for both planning and projects, and round 3 is currently open. We can see that some of the examples are across the state, from Accomack County to Buchanan County, and then actual implementation projects that Carolyn will chat about.
Wendy mentioned the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, and I'm not going to talk about it, but I just want you to look at this resource that is online. With the plan came a web viewer, and this web viewer is really interesting. You can dial down, zoom into specific areas, zoom out to see larger impacts, search according to flood risk horizon, and then see things like how many miles of roads will be impacted under different scenarios, how many structures will be impacted, where are the socially vulnerable located for this. There were some really important recommendations that came out of the Coastal Master Plan's Technical Advisory Committee, and these recommendations were submitted by individual signers of members of the TAC. And I just want to note that there's a lot of interest in oversight and kind of molding of efforts and alignment across the state flood risk issues. Money, money, money. We need more of it. More and better fine-tuned detail on risk assessment, engaged education and outreach, and tribal communities really must be better engaged on this issue.
So as MC mentioned, rainfall updates are really aligning for approximately a 20% increase in intensity, duration, and frequency, with more updates coming in a few years. We can skip ahead to this past winter. All of these actions are still awaiting governor action. He still has a few more weeks, but even though we flew through the text-heavy slides, these are really aligned with the recommendations of the Technical Advisory Committee to move forward with flood resiliency planning and ensure that it's in code, that we must, as a state, plan not just on the coast, but statewide, clarification of the duties of the Chief Resilience Officer. An additional source of funding was created. Whether the budget is allocated or not is separate, but the vehicle would be there. And without state funding, this vehicle can accept federal funds, potentially from the FEMA Storm Act funds when they come available. Going back to the oversight recommendation, the Soil and Water Conservation Board will have oversight over the CFPF funds with a reporting requirement added. And then adding to the complexity of the CBPA entitled Wetlands Guidance, Living Shorelines General Permit Code section was edited to include other structural organic materials, really adding to the clarity there.
And that's it. We have resources, and if the slides are distributed, you can click through them.
That's why the text is there.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Now we're gonna turn it over to Carolyn Heaps from the city of Hampton.
Thank you. So I am going to bring this now to the locality level and talk a little bit about what Hampton has been doing in our city. Let's make this full screen. Great. So thank you to all of my co-presenters. It's really excellent to be here with you and to listen to your topics and all of your information. What I'm going to cover today is a little bit about the Resilient Hampton Initiative, its origins and how it's structured, and then talk about a couple of our projects that have received funding from the Community Flood Preparedness Fund and other information on how we've been accessing some of those funding resources. So I won't linger on the slide. We're a coastal community with 400 years of history, and I think that by nature of being an urban place, highly developed location on our shorelines, and with this 124 miles of navigable waterway shorelines, we have an immense connection to our coast, but also a lot of challenges that we're facing. And these, I won't linger here either. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is what we share when we go out to speak at the community about when we're talking about climate change. This is what we mean. That we have all of these existing challenges that are being exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. Speaking of the Web Explorer, we use this. This is a great tool that we do rely on and that I use often to share some of these impacts. So this is that same Web Explorer from the state that was just shared. So this is a look at Hampton, currently 2020. And then this is what we're looking forward to in 2080 in terms of sea level rise as one of the biggest challenges that we faced as a coastal community. So this looks pretty dire, but I'm here to talk about why it's not, why we are hopeful about our future and how we've gone about crafting this vision for resilience. So the Resilient Hampton initiative has really kicked off and launched back in 2015 with the Dutch Dialogues, which was a workshop, 5-day workshop together with experts from the Netherlands and from New Orleans and with others throughout the Hampton Roads region to think about how we can live with water and treat water as an asset and mitigate flooding while also creating quality of life and well-being for our residents. That is really where we made a commitment to addressing this challenge, that our city leadership agreed that this is something worth investing in and thinking about. And that's where the initiative is really born from. So we take a lot of inspiration from this, and it was a way for setting the vision and setting forward what we were trying to accomplish and being hopeful about our future. From that Dutch Dialogues process, we established a framework, a citywide framework for Hampton that outlined what some of those values and guiding principles and goals looked like or would look like in practice. So how do we actually accomplish that work? So we finished that framework in 2018. And these are just some of the things that were captured in that framework document. Again, I'll highlight a couple. Working at multiple scales, adopting resiliency standards, using the best available science, and also incorporating equity. We heard a lot from Wendy about why equity is important, and Hampton has recognized that in our planning process and in how we're achieving this work, is that equity is a really central part of it. Also natural in the sense that we are trying to prioritize nature-based solutions. So that was also mentioned as something that the state has prioritized, and it's something that Hampton is incorporated into our plans as well. So all of this brought us to our mission of living with water. I should mention that throughout this process, we relied on partnerships, and among those were working with our consultants, Wagner and Ball and Bosch Slabbers from the Netherlands, and this phrase is somewhat borrowed from them. But again, our mission here is to envision, create, and empower our city to live and thrive with water and the impacts of climate change through approaches driven by data and values. So this is really our commitment to embracing a future where we're connecting with water while also adapting to the challenges that we face. I should also say that that framework document also set out some specific next steps. So it wasn't just how to do the work, but also what are we doing next? And so we set out a plan to do watershed level plans throughout the city that would get into more concrete planning. And the first stop we had was in the Newmarket Creek Watershed. The second stop was in downtown Phoebus and Buckrow. We are currently working on that plan, but we have wrapped up Newmarket Creek. That was done back in 2020, so a couple years ago. And that process was, again, important for visualizing and envisioning how we would bring the principles, the vision, the values to this particular area of the city, knowing that the challenges of different watersheds differ. So this map that you see on the left was a hand-drawn effort to understand how we could apply strategies for flood mitigation throughout the landscape. And so you'll see on the screen, slow, store, divert, et cetera. And what we were doing is identifying how these concrete ideas or concrete strategies, things like rain gardens for areas, green infrastructure for areas that are more upland where we can store more water in the landscape, versus areas where we really need to think about coastal conditions that are going to see increasing tidal influence, where we really need to think about adapting. So using these different strategies in different locations and envisioning what those look like, we came out with a set of more than 20 projects that were identified in this plan. And this is really important, I think, to the success of the plan, was that it wasn't only setting out, what we might do, but specific projects to carry out. And so that's been instrumental in ensuring that we have concepts at least in place that we can use to seek funding for these projects. So I'm going to switch gears slightly and just talk about Resilient Hampton Initiative and how we're structured and how we actually accomplish this work. So we are kind of framed under a City Council strategic priority that gives a backbone to our work and for living with water, which is the name of this priority area. This really highlights that we do have buy-in and support from our city leadership that sees value in doing this work and addressing the challenge. And also gives us the framework for kind of adapting. We have adapted the strategic priority as initiative has evolved, and we build our work plan, council strategic priorities, and our resiliency plans to be integrated and based around each other. This is a picture of our org chart. I like to share this to share a little bit about how we complete this work. So we have a division for resiliency that's based in our community development department, but we also have members of our Resilient Hampton team based around the city in all of these different departments. And this really highlights, again, that this resiliency work is collaborative. It needs to be based in a lot of different areas of expertise when we're talking about updates to tidal wetlands and to Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. These are things that members of our planning team and our wetlands board coordinator are responsible for doing, and they are a part of this resiliency team, and they bring that expertise to bear to our work. We also really rely heavily on the leadership and work of our partners, many of which are in the room here. I want to specifically mention the PDC, who takes a really excellent leadership role in advancing this work for our region, without which we wouldn't be where we are today. So I'm going to briefly touch upon just a couple of projects. Lake Hampton is one where we did receive community flood preparedness funds to implement. This is an image of this existing retention pond, which is a former borrow pit, which is a park area, and we are transforming it into a lake that can accommodate more stormwater storage while also raising this roadway here. So Armistead Avenue currently is subject to flooding from tidal events from New Market Creek. So with raising that roadway and connecting it to funnel down some of that stormwater into Lake Hampton, we're able to create some more storage in the landscape and also mitigate some flooding that is experienced. At the same time, we're doing more than just flood mitigation by adding these walking trails, new walking paths around the vicinity of the lake that connect to an existing walking path here called the Water Walk Trail that offer an opportunity for recreation, connection to the water in our community. This is just another image of how the project functions with regard to the flood mitigation elements. And then this is an image of what the existing shoreline looks like now and what we're planning to do with this boardwalk. So this project did come out of that New Market Creek water plan that I was talking about, that we really focused on identifying projects that were implementable and coming up with this list of project pipeline priorities. So I'm going to speak about a few things that I think have been successful in helping us to access some of the funding sources, including the Community Flood Preparedness Fund for our resiliency work. First of all, having this project pipeline, so I've said that a couple of times, it's been really crucial, and then communicating about that with other staff. So having emergency management, having our public works team engaged in these conversations about what are the resiliency projects that we're looking forward to, and working together to carry out those grant applications with those members of different teams. Again, working with partners has been really instrumental as well, learning from others, finding opportunities to advance mutual goals, and moving from just a list of projects to something that you have a little bit more of a conceptual design for is something that has been possible with support from various partners, including Wetlands Watch, to advance. So we're really grateful to all of our partners, including those listed here. This is not an exhaustive list, for all of your support in advancing this work. Also really critical has been aligning our values with the values of the funding sources that we are seeking. Somewhat by chance, somewhat by innovation and leadership, I think we have been successful in identifying some of these values, equity, nature-based solutions that have been reflected in subsequent statewide planning efforts and funding sources. And then lastly, I want to emphasize that none of our projects are using one exclusive funding stream. So you might hear about our environmental impact bond, which I haven't talked about in detail here today. It is one source of funding that we have used for our 3 pilot projects coming out of the New Market Creek Water Plan. However, for all of our projects, we're using multiple funding sources. We're not relying on a single one. So looking at the wide variety of different opportunities that exist, including looking ahead to the bipartisan infrastructure law and resiliency funding coming out of that opportunity, is something that we are doing and figuring out how to combine these sources together. Just to give an example, this is just the funding that we're using for those projects I was mentioning alone, highlighted in blue. So for a single project, we could have 4 different funding sources that we're using to implement it and actually do both design and construction. I want to end on saying that we are learning as we go, and there's other localities doing resiliency work in different ways. And I think all of us have something to offer and to learn from each other as we continue this work. So thank you.
So we don't have a lot of time, but I think we got a lot of really great information today. Does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? You can raise your hand and yell them out, or come on up to one of the microphones if you're comfortable with that. Yeah. Sure, that's fine. Yep.
I thank you all, the panelists, for really laying out in such detail the problems and the solutions that have been. I think Mary-Carson mentioned it, and it's certainly central to what Carolyn said, that funding is critical. I live and work in 2 coastal communities where this is not theoretical. It's about what routes you choose to drive home from work today, whether it's going to be flooded or not. So this is an immediate problem. And funding is critically important. And the Community Flood Preparedness Fund has been a ray of hope in many ways for coastal communities. And so we all know that that funding is tied directly to Reggie, and that is currently questionable whether it's going to continue. So I guess my question is, what happens if we lose that funding? And is there any planning currently to provide funding at that level?
So I'll start and then hand it off if anyone else wants to add. Carolyn showed a slide that listed 4 different funding sources for one project from design to completion. I think that more effectively than anything any of us have said today shows that we need every single source of funding available to tackle this problem and to build equitable solutions and increase our flood resilience. Flooding doesn't care where the boundaries are of our cities. Cities like Hampton have invested in staff. Cities like Virginia Beach have passed a massive bond referendum to fund some of these solutions. It's still not going to be enough. Cities like Norfolk were just allocated a huge amount of funding to protect downtown Norfolk. It's still not going to be enough because everyone is going to need match and to need to bring all of these funding sources together. And also critically of the CFPF funds, they build capacity in the localities that haven't already invested or don't have the resources to invest in staff. And so every piece of that pie and that toolkit is incredibly important. And we should look to long-term solutions as well as utilize to the fullest potential the CFPF funds from Reggie.
I do think the reliability piece is really huge. And I'm speaking for local government staff here, but this idea that there is continuous funding that's coming is really essential, I would guess. Planning, I work for an organization that's completely soft funded, and grant season is wild. And, you know, I'm not wearing 12 different municipal hats. And so I think that anytime that there's funding that can be consistently available on the same month, or the same several months, that kind of reliability is so important. So planning can occur and can be on schedule. And so sources of funding that have that are paramount. And the point of RGGI is to eventually have less coming from auctions. And so it is essential that Virginia look at investing state resources beyond and in addition to RGGI, because eventually we're not going to be generating as much. So I think that is really important to think about as well in state budget.
Any other questions? We're about out of time, so. Well, great. Thank you all very much for coming.